Okay, those of you who are still with us, thank you for staying. And this panel has two parts. I urge you to stay to the end because there's a surprise in the end. You'll see what it is. And we have 4 wonderful panelists to actually share with us what they have learned from Michael. So it could have been a panel of a few hours, but they were instructed to talk only for 10 to 15 minutes. And we start with Professor Chaim Gans. Chaim Gans has taught legal, moral, and political philosophy in the Faculty of Law in Tel Aviv University. And among his books are A Political Theory for the Jewish People. Sorry about so much Jewishness, but Khaled made me feel guilty. A Just Zionism and the Limits of Nationalism. Chaim.
I'm grateful for the opportunity to take part in this celebration of celebration of Michael Walzer's 90th birthday, and especially grateful that he is present here with us. I owe Walzer many debts of gratitude, both intellectual and personal. I was fortunate from the middle of my career onward, when I began to publish books on Jewish nationalism, to develop a sustained intellectual and personal friendship with Walzer. Still, I confess that I hesitated before agreeing to participate in a panel under so demanding a title as Walzer's legacy. His legacy is far broader and more diverse than I'm capable of assessing. So I'll adopt a more relaxed interpretation of this title and will anchor the few Walzerian themes I wish to address in his 2023 book, The Struggle for Decent Politics, on liberal as an adjective, bearing in mind his earlier writings that have particularly engaged me. Walzer's book concerns the attitude that thinking people adopt towards their a-liberal or non-liberal commitments and affiliations. What it is to be a liberal Jew, a liberal socialist, a liberal professor, a liberal communitarian, nationalist, etc. I have listed nearly all the groups and identities or ways of being, categories, that this full of wisdom book covers in order to highlight a category that is missing, that of liberals. At first glance, this seems tautological, just as the phrase illiberal liberals seems to be contradiction in terms. But this is not necessarily so. It depends, as such questions always do, on what exactly we mean. Most of those whom Walzer classifies as possibly liberal, professor Jews, and so forth, are liberal because they espouse pluralism or a tolerance towards alternative versions of their own identities or outlooks. A Jew is a liberal Jew if he recognizes that Judaism is open to multiple interpretations. A communitarian is liberal if he accepts that community may take diverse forms, not necessarily in the Rousseauian sense presented by Walzer, believing that people should devote their lives to their national Republican community. A nationalist is liberal if he is not a Mussolini, but a Mazzini, or, sorry for breaking the rhyme, Yael Tamir. That is, someone who recognizes the plurality of nations and their equal rights. Liberals in this sense must be liberals. They are tolerant toward a range of non-liberal ideology and necessarily towards versions of liberalism other than their own. However, another way to determine whether non-liberal categories like communitarians or Jews are liberal or illiberal is by reference not to their value monism or claim to infallibility, but rather their fanaticism or dogmatism. In fact, Walzer himself defines being liberal something by its opposite. We, he writes, speaking on behalf of the different collectivities of non-liberals, namely liberal nationalists or liberal professors or Jews, whatever our ideology, whatever our religion, we are not dogmatic. We are not fanatics. I think liberals can be dogmatic or doctrinaire in applying the general principles of their ideology. But equally, liberals can be too liberal. I'll begin in this sense. I'll begin with an example of a doctrinal liberal. I'll keep him anonymous. He argues for a full right of return for the Palestinian refugees of 1948, claiming that even if the Jewish war against the Arabs was a just war, Israel should have returned all the territories it captured then, because, he argues, if I purchase a plot of land and others invade it, I may be entitled to use force to expel them, but I do not, by virtue of their invasion, acquire a right to seize additional lands. The well-grounded moral intuition behind this analogy resembles the intuition underlying the doctrine of military necessity and the morality and international laws of war. However, this doctrine seems problematic when applied to the Jewish-Arab conflict of 47 to 49. It did not begin as a war between sovereign states, but as a war between ethno-national groups, Arabs seeking to prevent the group they attacked from realizing an international historical solution to the problem of its persecution, and Jews seeking to defend that solution in light of the Arabs' attempts to thwart it, or even, I should say, in light of the very good reasons Arabs had for attempting to thwart it. Walzer, with regard to particular aspects of Zionist practices or acts or episodes, seem to me to be a mirror image of the doctrinal liberal principle I have described. I would classify this mirror image as one of a too liberal or too permissive a-liberal. This also applies to Avishai Margalit. Walzer endorses Margalit's commentary on the Israeli Supreme Court's decision in the Rufeisen case. Margalit expresses the view, with which I surely agree, that the idea of Israel as a refuge is the only defensible rationale of Zionism. And in the aftermath of the Holocaust, he says, I quote, "No person could be turned down by the state of Israel who would have been persecuted as a Jew by the Nazis." If Margalit and Walzer mean that every person who fulfills the Nazi criteria for being Jewish has a right to migrate and be naturalized in Israel, I think they are too liberal regarding the desirable liberal limits of Israel's law of return. That law should grant such a right only to persons who are actually being persecuted as Jews and who are not being protected by their governments. I accept that this makes my liberal Zionism very skimpy in relation to my ethnocultural belonging, but I think Walzer and Margalit's liberal Zionism is too liberal in relation to their ethnocultural belonging, since it doesn't take into account the significance and the implications of the existing law of return for Palestinians, both Israeli and non-Israeli. These critiques of permissive liberalism flow from the need to evaluate political ideas and their applications in light of historical circumstances. Walzer is the last political theorist who needs reminding of this. And so, from his most recent book, I turn to one of his earliest and perhaps most important works. In Spheres of Justice, a defense of pluralism and equality in 1983, a critique of Rawls's original position and veil of ignorance, which were designed to prevent people from being biased by their self-interest when agreeing on principles of justice, Walzer argues that partiality towards self-interest is neither the principal source of moral blindness in ordinary people, nor what would most require a Rawlsian veil of ignorance to overcome it. Let me quote, "The problem is not, most importantly, with the particularism of interest. The greater problem is with the particularism of history, culture, and membership." End quote. What I would like to draw from this quotation, independently of Walzer's precise intention, is that the greatest danger to the general principles of political morality to which we subscribe and the particular judgment we draw from them is not bias towards personal self-interest, but bias towards the groups to which we belong. The main point with which I wish to conclude, however, concerns how Walzer continues the above quotation. He says, even if they are committed to impartiality, the question most likely to arise in the minds of the members of political community is not what would rational individual choose under universalizing conditions of such and such a sort, but rather what would individuals like us choose who are situated as we are, who share a culture and are determined to go on sharing it. And this question is readily transformed into what choices have we already made in the course of our common life? What understandings do we share? End quote. Here, Walzer doesn't reject universalization as a guide to proper moral political judgment, but he espouses the need to engage in universalization which the historical and local circumstances in which we find ourselves and in light of the relevant history required by such a universalization. It seems to me that as Rawls developed his political morality after A Theory of Justice was published in 1971, the more Walzerian he became. To my mind, he reaches his most Walzerian moment in his analysis of his notion of realistic utopia in his final 1999 book, The Law of Peoples. The very concept and Rawls's claim that developing a realistic utopia is one of the tasks of political philosophy brings him close to the Walzerian thesis from the Sphere of Justice that I quoted. And Rawls moves even more forcefully in Walzerian direction when he argues in The Law of Peoples that the historical experience accumulated over the recent centuries must shape any realistic utopia of domestic and global justice. If my interpretation of this Rawlsian concept and of the way Rawls develops it in his last book is correct, then it would be fair to say that in that central late 20th century debate on political philosophy, the winner by point, if not by knockout, was Walzer, not Rawls. Thank you.
Thank you, Chaim. I have a supportive evidence for that because I have a letter from Rawls saying, I actually know nothing about the real world. So it seems like you could add to the file. So our next speaker, Professor David Head, is a professor emeritus. We're all emeritus except for Noam, who is a young and rising star. In the Department of Philosophy at the Hebrew University, he works and teaches in the field of ethics, political philosophy, and bioethics. Thank you, David.
Thank you, Yuli. Thank you both. Well, it's a pleasure to be here, my dear friend Michael. I'm glad that it turns out that by coincidence I follow my good friend Chaim in my comments, because I'll follow him in many respects. My comment is personal. Like Chaim, I can't speak of Walzer's overall legacy, but I can truly speak of his legacy for me, to me. And so I won't summarize his contribution to political philosophy and the history of ideas. I'll stay content with some reflections on your impact on my own philosophical development. As a philosophy student, I was fascinated naturally by philosophical theories, grand or small. The first seminar I attended as a new graduate student in Oxford in 1972 was devoted to the newly published Theory of Justice by John Rawls. It was led by stars such as Hart, Hampshire, and Dworkin, with Brian Barry and Joseph Raz, Amartya Sen, and other luminaries sitting in the audience. I fell under the spell of Rawls's all-encompassing theory, and for many years was teaching Rawls and writing in my own works in a Rawlsian spirit. But as university teachers are expected to do, I always made an effort to expose my students to the criticisms of Rawls. And Walzer, of course, was one of the most famous and forceful critics. So, Spheres of Justice, the book, accompanied my teaching for the rest of my career till this very day, in which there's always one session in my course on justice and equality on the spheres of justice. So initially, I wasn't really sympathetic with the method and its communitarian assumptions of Michael's, but as older people here in the audience know from themselves, we naturally change in life and we mature in our tastes and opinions and general attitudes. I gradually lost my enthusiastic adherence to the view that philosophy necessarily built on abstract, universal, well-rounded theory, and learned to appreciate Walzer's recognition of the irreducible plurality of human values, moral principles, and political arrangements. This meant taking history seriously, not as an anecdotal confirmation of our present theoretical views, but as an essential component in the analysis of the most fundamental concepts, such as justice. Furthermore, Walzer taught me that the variety and heterogeneity of social institutions and practices calls for sensitivity to their uniqueness, which cannot be subjugated under one general theory. The difference principle cannot account for our specific views on just distributions of, for example, the burdens of conscription to the army, the justice of our health distribution of services, and education. Social life is inevitably divided into spheres. And despite the association of Walzer's work with communitarianism and the misleading contrast believed to distinguish between liberalism and communitarianism, the subtitle of the book, as Chaim mentioned, is a defense of pluralism and equality. That's the essence of the liberal attitude. By coincidence, barely 2 years after the publication of The Spheres of Justice, Bernard Williams, who has always been one of my philosophical heroes in ethics, came out with his book Ethics and the Limits of Philosophy, which can be regarded as an ethical analog to Walzer's political spheres of justice. Like Walzer, Williams cooled me down a bit in my faith in grand theories. Williams has also shown that the overall theory of morality cannot do justice to the infinite variety of our moral judgment, and even the concept of morality itself should be held in doubt. But Williams and Walzer drew inspiration from Aristotle's Ethics and Politics. So I came to the conclusion lately. But do not understand me. I'll return to Aristotle in a moment. Walzer's introduction to the spheres of justice was a highly significant theoretical contribution. It suggests a framework for the analysis of normative evaluations of justice of various social and political institutions. The two concepts of monopoly and domination, as well as the grounding of just distribution of a particular good in terms of social meaning, are the general principles which govern the analysis of a large number of various social practices and institutions. These are Walzer's theoretical tools which give unity and consistency to his large-scale investigation of justice across geographical and historical locations. The very last paragraph of Spheres of Justice mentions Aristotle's idea of distribution of political power by lottery system, another subject which I was very attracted to years ago. Despite its appeal, Walzer says in a modern society, this is not a practical method anymore, but follows Aristotle's idea that being ruled in one sphere does not mean being ruled in all other spheres. This is the main insightful thesis of domination, as the transgression from one sphere into a different and irrelevant one, the translation of one's superiority in one sphere into another. The wealthy gain political power is the most conspicuous example, of course. I happily came recently across a passage in Aristotle in which he explicitly offers us the same principle of the irrationality of what Walzer refers to as domination. Aristotle talks about flute playing and politics, and argues for the incommensurability of the qualities required for excellence in the two spheres. And he reaches the conclusion that, here I quote, since no such comparison can be made, it is evident that there's good reason why in politics men do not ground their claims to office on every sort of inequality any more than in the arts. That's in the politics. But that is to say, the fact that you are rich or an excellent flute player makes you deserve more. You are in a higher degree of excellence in one sphere, such as wealth or flute playing, but using one's excellence in wealth or flute playing to gain more political powers is, of course, irrational and a transgression of the spheres of justice. Politicians should excel in virtue and wisdom, not in fortune or musical talent. Aristotle here meets Walzer. Domination is the ultimate source of injustice. But then I have another quotation which I want to page homage to both Walzer and Williams. It is from Robert Musil's great novel, The Man Without Qualities. He says there, philosophers are violent people who, since they don't have armies at their disposal, they subjugate the world by imprisoning it within the walls of a system. I hope you like it, Michael. I want, towards the end, we want to mention two less significant encounters which I had with Michael. I read his book, The Paradox of Liberation, which was mentioned earlier. It compares, as we were told, Algeria, Israel, and India in the short history as independent states. Well, I won't go over it again. Shai told us the book's main thesis. And of course, this is of high relevance for us Israelis as one of the major threats to our democracy. But I had another personal interest in Walzer's study, this particular book. My late father, Uriel Hed, was a well-known historian of the Ottoman Empire and modern Turkey. He researched the similarities between Turkish nationalism and Zionism, which were both led by an emphatic secular ideology. Ataturk actually enforcing this secularism by law and by state power. My father's very last article, written months before his premature death in 1968, remember the date, 68, was entitled Revival of Islam in Modern Turkey. That was the time when no one felt an Islamic threat to Turkish secular constitution. But this article turned out to be prophetic. And of course, in 1968, we in Israel were already witness to the first signs of the revival of religious fundamentalism in our society and the threat to Israeli liberal democracy. I wrote to Michael a note about the possibility of adding in the next edition of this book a fourth paradigm example like Turkey. Lastly, I disagreed with Walzer's harsh judgment on Israel in the Pages attack, if you all remember, on Hezbollah, terrorism in Lebanon. This one of our disagreements. He treated it as a war crime. I was a bit puzzled and surprised when he wrote his note. And I tried also to defend the act as compatible with laws of jus in bello, but I would leave it as that. And finally, like so many people taking part in this celebration today, I have always felt generally the generosity and warmth of this amiable man, Michael, beyond the numerous meetings at home, his home, my home, the Hartman philosophical conferences, in university conferences and meals. In one year I was in Princeton. I remember one little gesture. Before arriving in Princeton for a sabbatical leave, I bought a car from Yair Loverboim, who is also here in the audience. The car, because Yair left before I arrived, was parked at Michael's home. When I arrived at the train station, I think, I called Michael to tell him that I'm here and whether it was good time to come and pick me up, pick up the car. He responded by saying, "But you don't have a car yet, so how can you get here?" "I'll come to you with a car." And so we did. So I'm grateful already 30 years later for that beautiful gesture, although I'm sure as a man of good manners, I thanked you already then. All of us owe you gratitude as individuals and as Israelis for your lasting concern for us as personal friends and as citizens of this troubled country. And this is a wonderful occasion to celebrate your long and immensely productive life and wish you more years of intellectual satisfaction from which we have all so much benefited. Thank you.
Thank you, David. I think we all join the good wishes, and it's really frustrating that every time we had some vision about a collapse of liberal system, it has been materialized. All our good thoughts are actually still floating in the air.
So the young one should not fear getting old.
No, they should not fear failure, because failure is what we, became experts in. Professor Fania Oz-Salzberger is a professor emerita of history at the University of Haifa in the Faculty of Law, and is a historian of idea and a political activist, which is very important these days.
Thank you very much for the invitation. Thank you, Yuli. Welcome, and a big hug to Michael and Judy. So glad that you are here. It is a kind of a consolation. By the way, Yuli, it's all very well for you to say that a woman should stand up when talking about politics, but you can be seen from behind the podium, and I cannot. I hope you can more or less see me. I'm going to embarrass you by thanking you to start with for being a father figure to us. And let me quickly say what I mean. You are a father figure to us in a very deep sense, intellectual and moral. And I was just saying about a month ago to Goel Pinto on the radio that the Israeli liberals and moderate left are bereft of father figures, or mother figures for the matter. We don't have either. We no longer have political parent figures like Shulamit Aloni or Rabin by the time he was assassinated, or Yossi Sarid, who could have become a wonderful grandfatherly figure for us. And we no longer have the literary father figures, Amos Oz, Aleph Bet Yoshua, no longer there, but we have you. And we have you, not least, as a model of the engaged scholar. I used to be an engaged scholar, very much consciously following you until 3 years ago when I crossed the line, I think, from engaged scholar to scholarly activist, which is a line I would like to cross back into heavyweight scholarship. But in many ways, your early work and later work in the history of political thought paved my own way, all the way from the Revolution of the Saints. I was still a little girl when that came out, until, of course, Exodus and Revolution in the 2000s, showing that the history of political thought can pave a road, a useful road, for political philosophy. We talked about it when I was at Princeton. We even had a little conference about it, and it is still very much occupying my thought. How can a historian of political thought be able to generate some good political insight, and I think that, or philosophical political insight, and I think that you have, both by calling attention to the Republican and liberal potentialities of reading the Hebrew Bible, which myself and several others joyfully followed into a full-blown claim for the Republican or proto-Republican character of some of our biblical texts. And all the way to the warning, a very good and judicious warning that you gave us later in your paper, wonderfully titled, "Where Were the Elders?" I think it came out in The Shadow of Religion, but it was published earlier, showing that much as we would like the early Israelite society to have been a full-blown proto-Greek republic, it's not exactly the case, seeing as those circles of decision makers, the liberators, sitting at the gate of the town, the elders, mentioned ever so often, but not really developed within the Hebrew Bible, as any viable institution on which we can lean when we say that this was a proto-republican society. It allowed me to reach a higher finesse, if you like, by saying that the Hebrew Bible is not a republican text, and as you have rightly argued, not a political text as such, but it sounds an enormous echo chamber. I'm going to be very careful in the way I phrase it. An enormous echo chamber which touches on the grand idea of the rule of the many. Not republic, not ancient democracy, not this, not that, but the rule of the many, because there are far too many voices in the Hebrew Bible. Men, women, Hebrews, non-Hebrews, speaking out loud and saying exactly what they are thinking, to call it a limited political culture. It was a broad political culture, but not in the sense of institutions of the rule of the many, at least not formal institutions, but in the sense of its multivocality and the legitimacy, the total legitimacy it often gave to the great virtue of argumentativeness. So in a way, your corrective with regard to the elders, with regard to the absence of republican institutions, led me to the claim made in Jews and Words, that this was a multiplicity of voices kind of culture without translating it in the Greek or the Roman or the modern republican sense into an institutional rule of the many. For this, I want to thank you. And I will have to mention here, although it will probably be revisited and more deeply discussed in the afternoon session, I have to move on now because I'm speaking, no paper, I'm speaking from my own bleeding heart. And not just bleeding heart, you know, people think that the brain, the ratio, the logos, the sechel, that our reason cannot be injured. Of course it can be injured. What we've been facing in the last few years is a constant barrage of injury and assault against our reason, not just our heart. And so I'm also speaking from my injured reason, sense of rationality, and we are under enormous attack in this respect, and therefore I have to speak about just war, and especially about that wonderful article that I discovered as an undergraduate, the problem of dirty hands, which I think came out in the early 70s, maybe even in 73. Problem of dirty hands. A leader, a good leader, a conscientious leader of a people, of a nation, in time of extremity, of emergency, especially of war, or great pinpointed threat to security, must have their hands dirty in order to defend their own, not their own interests, their own people or nation. But the only condition to making this part of a moral thinking about the state is for that particular statesman to acknowledge the dirt and to acknowledge the fact that he or she have performed an immoral act or made an immoral decision for the greater good, as might happen, and bear the guilt and bear the tragedy. Hence the wonderful expression of tragic responsibility. And I happened to read that as an undergraduate, shortly after reading Ruth Benedict's book, The Chrysanthemum and the Sword, about two kinds of cultures. It's quite a well-known and slightly simplistic dichotomy, but it's there. The culture of guilt and the culture of shame. Culture of guilt and its possible political counterpart, merit, and the culture of shame and its possible political counterpart, or its assured political counterpart, honor. And by honor, I mean, there's only one Hebrew word, kavod. I don't mean respect, and I don't mean dignity. I mean honor in the pre-modern, mostly masculine sense of the word. And it occurred to me then, if we take Benedict's distinction seriously, that the kind of leader capable of the tragic responsibility that Michael had written about can only be a leader raised in the guilt culture and not in the shame culture. Guilt culture meaning the individual sense of responsibility to one's acts and the acts of one's larger group. Individual moral responsibility. Shame being cultural, collective, honor being even more collective than that. But what if a leader does not come or has left and banged the door on the culture of guilt? What if a leader, dirtying his hands on all our behalves, is no longer an emissary of the culture of guilt, but of the culture of honor, of kavod, a culture that dismisses not just individual responsibility for acting against humanity, but even celebrating some actions against humanity as possibly adding to the honor of one's own national group, or somehow making up for shame inflicted on that particular national group. And you use the word tragic, which is a deeply Western term, or originally a Western term. There is a wonderful short story by Jorge Luis Borges about that, about the inability of great Muslim scholars to read Greek tragedies and single out the tragic within them. Maybe this is not the case anymore. Maybe it never was. I don't even think it's a global south or global north kind of distinction, but it is absolutely clear that a leader without the tragic sense of responsibility to dirty hands in wartime is catering to a new and anti-humanist culture of honor. And this culture of honor is prevalent among Israel's leading political elite today. No more dirty hands. The very request, and now I'm being tangential to Michael's article, the very request would sound ridiculous to the decision makers of today here in Jerusalem. And going back to the beginning and asking how can we be engaged scholars, at the very least, or perhaps even scholarly activists, it is, I think, in following Michael's insistence that the tragedy of the other's fate is part of our own lifeline, and that the tragedy of our own existence under a leadership that does not recognize tragedy anymore or moral responsibility anymore is part of our lifeline and demands immediate engagement. So I don't know how to save liberalism. We have been talking about it from so many perspectives. I was brought up a social democrat, maybe that's one open door still. But I do know that insistence on the individual conscience, on the individual's sense of guilt, and the horrific fear that too many of my fellow Israelis have been raised without an individual sense of guilt in this respect, are calling upon me not just to continue, but to reframe the issue of tragic responsibility, not just of leaders, also of a soldier in the field, in the battlefield, also of a citizen in the town square, and to see how it can revive. So I do not want to finish my words in praising both tragedy and guilt, but I think that both tragedy and guilt have been a tremendous atom in the universe of early Western culture and of early Israelite culture, and perhaps through generation of much of Jewish culture, ready to be re-excavated, ready to be revived. Thank you, Michael, for your fatherhood.
Thank you, Fania, for these wonderful words. I think it's a paradox to blame Jews for not feeling guilty. Exactly. I know my mother didn't think that way, but anyhow, our last speaker is the youngest one, Professor Noam Gidron from the Political Science Department in the Jerusalem University, who is actually an expert on political psychology and political science. Noam, thank you.
Hi. Well, many thanks to Yuli for this kind introduction, to all the participants here in the panel, to the Leer Institute, and of course, first and foremost, many thanks to Michael Walzer for being with us here today. I'm truly humbled to be in this conference with so many people whose work I admire, and I truly, truly mean that. Reading and rereading Walzer's work on liberalism and on liberals for our meeting today has been extremely interesting and inspiring and rewarding, especially as concerns over the future of liberal democracy intensify in Israel, in the United States, in South Korea, in Brazil, in Poland, in Hungary, and in many other countries. Today, I want to focus on two main points related to these concerns. First, with regard to Walzer's unique approach to the study of politics. And second, regarding his interpretation of and call for engagement between liberal and illiberal political actors. I should note up front, as Yuli just mentioned, that I'm a bit of an outsider here in this panel. I'm a political scientist studying comparative politics rather than political theory, history, or philosophy. And I mention this because our academic disciplines are increasingly siloed, with a deepening divide between the normative and empirical study of politics. Yet, rereading Walzer's book and articles for today's conference, I was struck by how much his approach is an invitation to disregard this divide. Walzer consistently grounds his theoretical ideas, reflections, and arguments in real-world cases. In his most recent book, The Struggle for a Decent Politics, on Liberal as an Adjective, he describes this as writing from the inside. His discussion of nationalism in that book exemplifies this perfectly, as he writes, and I quote, "Everything I know and every opinion I have about nationalism comes from my engagement with Israel and my visits there." Imagine reading a sentence like that today in the American Political Science Review or any other leading political science journal. And this commitment to empirically grounded theory isn't unique to just this one book. In The Paradox of Liberation, which we just discussed, Walzer similarly writes, "I have always had difficulty sustaining an abstract argument for more than a few sentences." This book, in fact, functions not only as an exploration of political ideas, their successes and failures, but also as a comparative study that squarely fits the most different system design, which I teach in my Intro to Comparative Politics class. This way of approaching political problems contrasts sharply with the common line of writing in contemporary political science. There, theorists often either take a historical view, tracing the evolution of concepts over time, or an ahistorical view, dissecting abstract concepts. It also differs significantly from current empirical political science work of the type that I'm doing, where we often seek to isolate well-identified causal relations and tend to avoid normative debates. Walzer's writing invites us to integrate theory and case studies. Such an integrative perspective allows us to construct and then sharpen our normative sensibilities by examining the imperfect, messy, and conflictual world in which we inhabit. Walzer's work masterfully charts this road. But unfortunately, we should also concede that to a large degree it remains a road not taken in mainstream political science. But this Walzerian approach or method is not just appealing, it is urgent, specifically in this particular political moment, as we grapple with the ongoing crisis of liberalism and the growing appeal of populist authoritarian movements, parties, and leaders. This dual perspective, which bridges the normative and empirical divide, offers a crucially useful lens to answer pressing questions such as how do people make sense of their national identities? And how do common conceptions of nationhood inform people's political values, interpretation of democracy, and, at the end of the day, who they vote for? Next to nationalism, social recognition and respect, already addressed in Walzer's masterpiece Spheres of Justice, similarly deserves such a combined normative empirical investigation. For instance, how are we to understand the role of social recognition in shaping people's political attitudes? What social and economic circumstances may generate a deficit in recognition? And how might such a deficit nudge people toward populist authoritarians who promise to restore a sense of social standing in a changing world? These are some of the most pressing questions on the agenda of social scientists today, and Walzer's work offers an inspiring framework for addressing them. So Walzer's writing offers a valuable roadmap for social science about how to study the crisis of liberalism in this particular moment of democratic backsliding. But perhaps we can also ask ourselves, is it time for us to reconsider some of the explicit and implicit assumptions we often encounter in debates over liberalism? Walzer, here not only as the theorist but also as the social critic, urges us to remain rooted in our political reality and embedded in our communities. Then perhaps, as the reality around us and our communities shift and turn, we need to reevaluate some previous arguments about our political ideas. And this becomes particularly urgent given the rise to power of authoritarian illiberal leaders, those who openly express their commitment to illiberal regimes. And on this front, I do believe we may need to reconsider the roadmap we find in some of the work we discussed today. My main concern here is that our current analytical lenses for analyzing liberalism and its struggles are largely built on the assumption reflecting the world of the last 80 years or so. We assume that small L liberals, whether center-left social democrats or center-right conservatives or Christian Democrats, are typically in power, responding to demands from illiberal challengers. But what happens when these roles are reversed? That is, what happens when illiberals hold power and liberals are the ones challenging an illiberal hegemony from the sidelines? Arguably, this is going to be the situation in a growing number of countries, yet our theoretical and empirical work has not really adjusted yet to this reality. It is in this context that I read The Paradox of Liberation, and I won't summarize the argument of the book because we've just discussed it, but I still highly recommend reading it. It is beautifully written. The book explores how, across very different countries, Israel, India, and Algeria, secularist movements secure the goal of national liberation, only to quickly face an increasingly strong religious reaction. In Walzer's words, and I'm quoting, secular liberation hasn't been defeated, but it has been challenged in unexpected ways with unexpected strength. The central question then follows: how should liberals in power respond to the illiberal reaction, challenging them? And the proposed answer is with liberal critical engagement. I want to say something about this answer, but first let's reconsider the question itself. The question is based on the premise, as I just quoted from the text, that secular liberation hasn't been defeated. It assumes a world in which liberals may see their power diminished, but they still hold on to power. But then what happens when liberals have, in fact, been defeated? Increasingly, illiberals are not merely challenging the centers of power. They are the center of power. In such a world, the crucial question shifts. It's no longer about how the liberal hegemony deals with illiberal challenges and demands, but rather how liberals contest illiberal elites and the state institutions they control. And if this is indeed the case, then we need to recalibrate the question we asked about the challenges and strategies of liberals today. And given this changing balance of power between liberals and illiberals, we may rethink not only the questions we ask, but also Walzer's proposed answer, that of liberal critical engagement with reactionary forces. Engagement makes good sense as an effort by those in power to include groups who demand a seat at the table, those who feel, rightly so, that their beliefs and ways of life have gone unrecognized, underappreciated, undervalued, or even negated, in Walzer's terms, by liberal elites. Walzer makes a strong case for liberal politicians and intellectuals, those who value constraints and pluralism, to accommodate and create space for those whose worldviews differ fundamentally from their own. But what does it mean for defeated liberals to seek engagement with illiberal forces in power? These illiberals are, by definition, not interested in a pluralist public sphere. That's what makes them illiberal to begin with. Should liberal challengers who compete on an unleveled playing field tilted by populist authoritarians in power prioritize engagement with those whose avowed beliefs are to establish an illiberal state and wield unconstrained power? Another way of interpreting this call for liberal engagement shifts the focus from the elite level to the general public. And here, this different way of posing the argument goes something as follows. Even after defeat, liberals should engage with illiberal traditions and beliefs in order to attract voters from the illiberal camp. And I see two issues, or potential issues, with such an argument. First, I'm not sure we have strong evidence suggesting it actually works. When liberals attempt to present themselves to the public as lightweight populists and adopt the rhetorical framework and policy positions of their illiberal opponents, they typically fail to attract new voters from the authoritarian political bloc. This issue has been thoroughly examined in recent studies in comparative politics of Western Europe, based on the analysis of cross-national survey data. At the end of the day, voters of illiberal authoritarian parties prefer the original to a pale copy. It is telling that the paradox of liberation includes cases in which lack of sufficient engagement was followed by the rise of reactionary movements, but no clear examples of cases where engagement was successfully employed to consolidate the power of the secularist movement. In fact, Walzer concedes this point with this comment, and I'm quoting, "After all, those who did try to engage with traditions of their people rather than simply negate them were not successful in any of the cases I'm considering." From the perspective of case selection in comparative politics, such a case of successful engagement could have bolstered our confidence in the argument, notwithstanding its many merits and intellectual contributions. Now, not only that this strategy of engagement may fail to attract new voters from the illiberal bloc, it may actually deflate the liberal base of support itself. As liberal parties and candidates bravely confront the illiberal establishment, oftentimes at some risk, it could prove rather challenging to rally their supporters, to excite their base by calling for more engagement with the other side. This is also something we've seen abroad. As liberal parties adopted some of the positions of their illiberal competitors, they didn't only fail to attract new supporters, but their own supporters were more likely to defect or abstain. Then, what is to be done in this era of autocratization and democratic backsliding? Well, that's of course much harder to say, but perhaps as liberals find themselves out of power, there is something to be said for thinking about liberalism also, not exclusively, as a fighting creed, as an offer of a clear vision that differs fundamentally from the one proposed by illiberal authoritarians. And this perspective doesn't mean abandoning intellectual engagement with new and old ideas. Instead, it does call for thinking about liberals not as power holders adjudicating between competing demands, but rather as political challengers who seek to mobilize, excite, and inspire a diverse base of support in the fight for liberal democracy. Over the past decades, Michael Walzer has provided us with an invaluable toolbox for considering how to connect our ideals with everyday experiences. It is now up to us to rethink how best to use this immensely rich resource to address this current political moment of democratic crisis, with all its challenges and hopefully also the opportunities it presents. Many thanks.
Thank you, Noam. Please stay seated for we can go down. And there is a small present surprise for Michael. Don't have too high expectations. And
I'm Nancy Rosenblum, and this is a personal history of gratitude for Michael Walzer. In 1966, my sophomore year at Radcliffe, I enrolled in Michael's class on the history of modern political thought. With few exceptions, I had never heard of the books on the reading list or considered that political thought had a history, but I had spent my senior high school year as an exchange student in Brazil, in the home of a general who was central to the overthrow of President Goulart's democratic regime. I thought I might learn about coup d'etat, and then there was the war, and I was reading Dissent. Besides, I was hoping to be admitted to the social studies program Michael headed. The course was the gift. I could not have imagined a republic of letters, authors speaking to one another across time. Twice a week, Michael stood in front of a class in Emerson Hall and puzzled aloud. Hobbes on obligation, Rousseau's overheated community. It was a revelation, a mind interpreting and criticizing political ideas right in front of us, ardently, bringing his arguments to life not with hypotheticals, but with lived experience, urging us to follow his train of thought and to question it if we could. I wanted to try to do what he was doing. So I think of Michael every time I quote this line from Wordsworth's poem to my students: "What we have loved, others will love, and we will teach them how." In the social studies program, I proposed a senior thesis using Erik Erikson's life stages to examine Hegel's philosophy of history. The topic was fatally misguided, but I couldn't be dissuaded. Even so, Michael agreed to be my advisor and labored week after week to make some sense of what I was doing without crushing me. And then, in 1983, Spheres of Justice arrived, with its stunning thesis of complex equality and pluralist principles of distributive justice. The argument that there's an inner logic, a social and moral logic to provision, and at the same time the caution that social meanings are historical in character, and so distributions change over time. With this came his claim that membership in some human community is the primary good, meaning that membership itself is distributed. So we in the United States, like every pluralist state, that is every state, wrestle, literally wrestle, and as we know, much worse, with who we are, who can become members, and who decides. Spheres of Justice was my touchstone when I challenged the stern logic of congruence advanced by democratic theorists who insisted that public democratic principles and practices should shape membership and morals everywhere and all the way down. I wrote about pluralism, about the universe of voluntary associations, and about the distinctive character of the democracy of everyday life among neighbors. And at Michael's invitation, I wrote a piece for the Jewish political tradition on Maimonides' account of tzedakah that has shaped my practice of giving. A final word about Michael's latest book, The Struggle for a Decent Politics. Instead of a contested account of what liberal political philosophy was and when and is now, he lays out the work the adjective liberal performs attached to Democrats, socialists, nationalists, and internationalists, feminists, professors, and intellectuals, and liberal Jews. He names names. But much more, the book is a political memoir. Each application of the adjective liberal comes attached to references collected over a lifetime of reading, people he worked with, comrades he marched with, and he salutes political theorists, for we are allowed to take positions, he writes, and to act on them. Michael's political theory, social criticism, and political activism are original, important, and inseparable. They have generated literatures of their own. In my life, his work has a place of its own. In the disorganized mess of my office, there's a designated shelf for his books. Thank you, Michael, and happy birthday.
Sorry, since I didn't say who the people are, so Michael knows, but this is Professor Nancy Rosenblum from Harvard University, followed by two other friends, Professor Michael Ignatieff and Professor Amy Gottman. They should have been on the panel, but we couldn't bring them over, so they send their greetings and few words.
Hi there, this is Michael Ignatieff talking to you from Vienna, Austria. I want to send warm greetings to my Israeli friends, especially at this particular moment in your country's history. And I'm delighted to join with you in praising Michael Walzer. I hope he'll be basking in the love and respect of everyone at this conference. I first remember meeting Michael in 1970 at Harvard when I was a young graduate student. And I remember how terrified I was of meeting this shy, retiring man. I think I was terrified partially because of the fearsome reputation of his wonderful book, The Revolution of the Saints, which I had devoured as a student. I also admired him because he had gone down to Washington in 1970 and told Henry Kissinger to stop bombing Cambodia, a moment that I remember vividly. And ever since, I've admired Michael's social democratic convictions. I've admired his Zionism. I've admired his politics of conviction married to responsibility. His work on the ethics of war, his wonderful essay on the problem of dirty hands, exercised a real influence on me, particularly when I went into politics. As Yuli Tamir, who's also been in politics, knows, you have to deal with the problem of dirty hands in politics all the time, and Michael's guidance on that question was crucial. Michael's hands, of course, are spotless, and a lifetime of inspiring others means that we all have a moment to stand back and acknowledge a truly extraordinary man. I hope he basks in the admiration of everyone who loves and respects him, as I do. Thank you, Michael.
Michael Walzer once said this to me: in any lecture, you can really only make 3 points. And I assure you I'm not about to lecture for 45 minutes. Though it was at Michael's lectures on the history of political theory that our paths first crossed. Me, a freshman and a nerdy Jewish girl, just arrived in Cambridge, Massachusetts from a rural and very Protestant hometown. Michael, an already famous Harvard professor. Me, a math major. Michael, a real live Jewish intellectual whose course completely changed the course of my studies and academic career. What Michael remembers is that I once invited him to a dinner in my Radcliffe dorm cafeteria. What I recall is another dinner, one at Michael and Judy's home, where I met their daughters Sarah and Becky for the first time. To this day, I feel amazed, thrilled, and so grateful for this mitzvah Michael bestowed on me. The first in my family to go to any college, forget about Harvard. And there I was intellectually sparring across the dinner table with the great Professor Walzer and his family. But back to those 3 points. First and fundamental, no one, aside from my nearest kin, no one has had as great an intellectual influence on my life. For 60 years, I've been in constant dialogue with Michael's thinking, his writing, and his orientation as an intellectual. As proof that political philosophy as a field has profound gravity out in the field, Michael's arguments in Just and Unjust War grounded my diplomacy as U.S. ambassador to Germany, specifically in helping Germany become the largest military, economic, and humanitarian supporter of Ukraine, other than the United States. On this, I'll never forget working with four-star General Darrell Williams. We bonded strongly because once he knew I was a political philosopher, he asked me, do I know Michael Walzer's work? Now, mind you, General Williams had never met Michael, but we agreed that Michael's ideas and work captured precisely and eloquently why the US, Germany, and all our democratic allies simply had to do everything in our power to help Ukraine fight for its democratic sovereignty. Which leads me to point number 2, engaged criticism, also known as kibitzing. Michael has modeled this kind of life from the time I met him, when the Vietnam War was raging and protests mounting, to this very day, when both American and Middle East politics are in crises. Michael encouraged me to join amazingly engaged Israeli friends and colleagues at the Hartman Institute for what we called summer camp for Jewish intellectuals, Talmud in the morning, political theory in the afternoon, and politics after dinner, about as close to intellectual heaven on earth as I can ever hope to inhabit. Memories of those close connections bring me to my third point. Even when the going gets tough, Michael never gives up on our agency as human beings. A pragmatic optimist, he avoids disillusionment since he was never under the illusion it would be easy in the first place. That our world provides ample cause for pessimism is no excuse in Michael's book, because the effect of pessimism reinforces the pessimist's cause, but the effect of optimism reinforces our ability to make the most positive difference in our world. Michael, you have made the most positive difference in our world and in mine. You have transformed my life as you have so many students, colleagues, and friends. You have done more than shed light. You've ignited a beacon, a blazing illumination of how and why democratic citizenship calls for engaged criticism, collective action, and rugged optimism. Here's to your 90th and many, many more.